I was talking to somebody a few weeks ago, and they really wanted to understand what the five nines were about, Alan. And is it one in 100,000? Is it one in 300,000? FDA put out their draft guidance in 2020. There hasn't been a final guidance. So I just wanted to unpack five nines with Alan. So maybe give us a 10,000 foot view. Where did this come from? Why is it a thing?
So I'll just say right up front, if you're testing or if you're thinking that you need to test one in 300,000 samples or something to demonstrate the five nines reliability, I would not recommend that. And that's not what the agency would want to see. And I don't think that's feasible or helpful.
Have any companies actually done that?
No, not that I've seen.
Okay.
You know. But that conversation around, is that really what you're expecting, has happened multiple times. And just the feasibility of that, because I think when people see, a reliability value, 99.999%, and you go through your typical, okay, what's my sample size calculation based on that failure rate, you will end up with a number over 300,000. So that I think is just in part maybe a little bit of a misunderstanding about what it is the agency is asking for and how to demonstrate the different ways that you can demonstrate the reliability of a device or a system. And so the sort of the goal or the objective is to demonstrate that something that, at least in terms of how the guidance describes what the agency is asking for, is when you have a product where the failure of that product to deliver the drug when it's needed in that one opportunity, in terms of anything else that might be around it, availability of other products or medical assistance or the condition that's being treated, there's a likelihood of death or serious injury based on whatever the attribute of that product is. And some of the examples in the guidance, epinephrine injectors, some of the opioid, like naloxone injectors, glucagon for severe hypoglycemia are some of the examples where if that device fails, then the patient could be severely harmed. And so the goal really is to have a high degree of reliability that any random device that patient might have is likely to succeed in its operation. And so part of it, I think the way I've always viewed this is when we're talking about reliability, there's sort of two different sides of this. One is I have a specification, whether it's a dose accuracy or an injection time, and I have a tolerance interval around that specification. How much reliability do I have that I'm going to be within that window, that specification, right? And so there's variable sampling plans you can come up with, and you test 60 samples, you get your K value, and that tells you, okay, within statistics, I've got 99% reliability or 95% reliability. And so what that tells me is that given that a device operates, I'm likely to be within that specification window.
The idea that you would use something like a tolerance interval starts with an assumption that the plunger will move.
Correct.
So let's say the plunger can't move, then your tolerance interval isn't meaningful then.
Correct. Yeah. And that's really what the agency is asking for here. Is it's a step removed from like individual verification studies, which of course are important. It's the bigger question is, what's the probability that the device is going to operate at all? Like any random device that you pick up that comes off the line, what's the probability that it's going to operate? And that's a different question than, okay, I'm doing an extrusion force or I'm doing an activation force or
Injection time, cap removal for whatever it is.
Correct. So I always thought about it as it's like a conditional probability, whereas given that the device operates, what's the reliability that I'm going to get the dose accuracy that I want? Or given that the device operates, what's the likelihood that I'll get the extrusion force that I want? And that's normally the universe that we operate in when we're talking design verification is given that the device operates. And so the higher level question, how do you have reliability around, is the device going to operate, is an important question. Because most of the time, if the device doesn't operate, okay, that's unfortunate, but the patient's not likely going to die. There's not a probability the patient's going to die or be severely harmed immediately. And they can get some other intervention, which is why the agency doesn't typically ask for this type of information for most products.
With the exception of the emergency use,
Correct.
which is the I don't want to call it narrow scope, but we'll say the scope of the guidance. So where did This is always a discussion that happens when people are talking about incoming inspection, release testing. It's always a judgment call, right? As far as what AQLs are you going to apply? What controls are you going to apply? What are you going to put upstream and downstream, et cetera? And so the 99.999 is a judgment call. To some, it may seem high. To others, I'm sure it may seem low. So how did FDA land on that number?
In the guidance, I believe there's some language to try to help communicate why or how that information was determined. So I think up front, the agency gets asked a lot, just tell us what you want. And then I think sometimes they get criticized when they actually do tell an industry what they want. And it's not, okay, we said tell us what you want, but not that way. And so I think in this case, the guidance that the agency published, there's at least a paragraph or two describing the thinking that went into why 99.999%. And they relied on information in ISO 14971, some of the examples in terms of the different levels, like 1 in 100,000, 1 in a million, et cetera, and where at least the standard sort of put remote or extreme remote, I forget the exact terminology that the standard put in. And so I think there was a desire, obviously, like you said, some people probably think it's too high. Some people, I definitely heard as it was being developed, didn't think it was high enough. And so I think there was an attempt to balance between what is reasonable in terms of feasibility, not wanting to put a value that's so high that you preclude products from being able to be developed because it's too difficult, too technically difficult or costly, but also protecting the public health at the same time and actually having products that are safe and effective for what they're intended for.
As far as the existing products that are on the market, how much did state of the art play into selecting that number? Because whenever you're putting together and I know guidance is not a standard, but whenever you're putting together a standard, the idea is that it's table stakes and not like the highest requirement possible. And so you don't want to say any new product has to be 10 times more reliable than everything that was already approved on the market. And so was there any benchmarking done to understand what were previous expectations for products? I know there were also some warning letters and some product quality issues that companies were facing in this space that also drove, I think, more guidance.
Correct. Yeah. So those conversations were probably all happening around the same time where you identify what you think is a technical need, and then other things are happening in the quality or the post-market space that might be driving the rest of the agency, particularly like senior leaders, to identify that there's a need as well, right? And so when those come together, you have an opportunity to write policies like this that can then hopefully make an improvement. And of course, part of it is, are you being consistent with what was done historically? Or if you aren't, how does the agency deal with that from a regulatory standpoint? So that, yeah, that absolutely would be expected to happen when these types of policies are written.
But did, like any specifics that come to mind as far as looking into the products that were previously approved? Or I should say, was this an expectation before it just became written? So you mentioned earlier that companies were doing like like type C meetings or whatever to try and understand what is the expectation that we're supposed to, what is our target, and that FDA would have to communicate that on an individual basis. Was this just taking an existing expectation and just translating it into a guidance?
I think everybody would expect that the products in this space would be reliable. I think
Yeah, because I think the reason that I asked the question is that when the five nines came out, it was for some people there was some shock and awe at the requirement, and some of it was the back of the napkin. Oh, we need to test 300. We need to test like multiple batches and have zero failures. And like, how do you know that 299,997 isn't going to have an issue?
yeah, no, and I think that gets into like, how do you actually demonstrate that you've met that level, technical perspective? But yeah, there's always been an expectation that these types of products are reliable. I think the difference is making it a formal request where the agency is putting a number around it. And I think that is probably the shift or the change. which then as a result of that is, okay, how do you actually do that? And that was a lot of the type of, like you mentioned, type C meetings or other interactions that might occur, and some of the standards work that's been generated since then that's still ongoing about how do you actually demonstrate different levels of reliability.
So, what are the different flavors of ways that you've seen companies try and deal with this requirement? So, like it's not test 300,000.
Correct. Yeah, what I always recommended is using fault tree analysis, where you're starting at the, I think the way the agency describes it in the guidance is the failure to inject or failure to successfully inject is like your top level fault, attaching your 99.99% value at that level and then breaking down the failure modes for the EPRs, not EDDOs that you would want to be supporting in order to achieve that level. And the ideally where you would take that is where in the linking the design requirements down to the manufacturing processes where those failures could occur. Right. So you get at, for example, what are the sort of the quality levels for a certain molding process? What are the inspection steps? And what's the probability of catching or not catching certain failure modes at certain inspection steps? And so the fault trees then sort of linking the actual production of the device back into the design requirements that are necessary to achieve successful injection.
So, it's you're saying it's not a 99.999% confidence it's not a five nines reliability 95% confidence in the like typical design verification sense, because that's where people immediately go. It's top line 99.999% reliability against this failure to inject, which could result from a bunch of different. And we talked earlier about when you're doing your tolerance intervals, that there's a underlying assumption that the device is on its way to functioning or actually functioning. The force can be high, but it's still works is the wrong word, but you know what I'm saying. You can still measure a force if something is moving, but if it's not, then if the cap can't be removed, then you'll break the device before you essentially can measure. The force it'll be a threshold of failure kind of thing if the cap can't be removed.
Yeah, to your question about the 300,000 samples, my concern is even if you tested 300,000 samples and demonstrated zero failures, it tells me that that sample set met that level of reliability. That doesn't tell me anything about any future production. And so
And that's where the confidence comes in. Is like the confidence calculation is how do I like to what level can I assume that 300,001 will operate in the same way as the previous and not against the way that you tested. Like
I should take
I'm gonna
that back.
ask.
I should say it doesn't tell me anything about it because obviously it does tell you some information about the overall production quality. I just, I don't think it's, yeah, go ahead.
But by itself, like it would tell you something if you say I'm 95% confident. But if you don't, then it doesn't tell you anything. The outside of the warm and fuzzy that you may have. But so going back to the fault tree analysis, you're saying that you should tie the okay, if I understand this correctly, if a product would fail to inject, it would be because of an issue in the process. That's the point.
So for, let's say,
Like let's maybe rather than me try and intellectualize it, let's go through a basic example of and let's say an emergency use pre-filled syringe, even though there isn't many, right, practically speaking, but the parameters are more simple with that than say an auto injector. So failure to inject 99.99% top line reliability, and then you're going through your faults. Could you walk through what you would be looking at?
sure, yeah. So I would start with what are the essential sort of design outputs from a drug delivery standpoint, right? So cap removal, extrusion force, delivered volume accuracy. So let's start with the cap, right? That's relatively straightforward. If the patient can't get the cap off or the user can't get the cap off, you can't get your dose, right? So then you break down, okay, what are the ways in which the cap might fail to be removed? And where in the manufacturing process are those steps either assured? So there's specifications around the fit between the barrel and the cap. Are there other failure modes that might occur, drug leakage that might then occlude the cap or something, seal the cap in or something. And how might that happen? And so you're breaking down what are the failure modes that are related to that attribute, where in the manufacturing process do those occur, and how can you generate information or reliability information around those steps that could then, when you collectively deal with the full tree, then roll up to that higher degree of reliability.
But then
And
what
some
would
of
that
it
look like?
isn't just the processes themselves, it's the checks that you're doing. So they're adding, you almost treat it as like a redundancy, the tests, right? So you have reliability information around the actual production steps. The tests themselves are almost like a redundancy from a reliability standpoint. So you can increase your levels of reliability by the types of tests and checks that you're doing.
I think that where maybe people get caught up, and maybe myself included, is the being worried about getting caught in a technicality, let's say. So I would say everything that you're talking about is aligned with general controls. And so as far as like the, particularly on the five nines, so let's to use like a basic interaction between a cap and a lure hub or whatever. You could say this is the critical dimension, and we're going to have a very high capability target. And if the capability is super high, we're going to even tighten the spec, and so on and so forth. But how does that lead to you being able to say you've met the reliability?
When taken as a whole, as part of the full tree. So that's one example where you walk down from the top down to the actual point at which you're making decisions about how to control it. And when you do that
Mm.
across the entire device, from a fault tree analysis, do the analysis on the fault tree, and you can get
Yeah.
the.
So maybe where my questions are coming from is that there's okay, I'm assuming you have to do some testing at the end against the failure to inject parameters. And so does the design verification or reliability testing that you do for these kinds of products, does it need to be like what reliability and confidence level are you doing delivered volume and cap removal and break loose extrusion force stuff like that too?
Oh, I see your question. Yeah. So the other side of this is I guess what you could call like reliability challenge testing, where you're taking the actual products and running them through your preconditioning, right? You might even talks about like doing sequential conditioning, right? You're really challenging the robustness of the product, to use a different word. So your question is how do you decide how many samples?
Well, like out, so I think you made it clear that the five nines isn't talking about design verification. It's talking about a fault tree analysis that you described as you need to be able to try and demonstrate that reliability, but it's not cut and dry, test the finished product 300,000 or whatever. It's more, can you demonstrate on paper that all of the controls that you have in place will get you to 99.99% in the fault tree? I understand that. I think where I'm getting at is, let's say you're doing design verification. If you're not doing five nines, what should you do for something that would be potentially like an S5 catastrophic failure? What does the DV look like? Because that's less, I feel, subjective than the fault tree, if unless I'm misunderstanding. Because if you're going to go down and say these dimensions and this process parameter, and there's a lot of give when you're trying to paint the story, because you're going one level, second level, third level, fourth level, fifth level, or whatever. Whereas there is something to be said about just testing the final product and having confidence that when you put it all together. I learned this the hard way when I was working in infusion pumps, because there's so many sub-assemblies, subsystems, et cetera, that build up to it. And there is electrical and mechanical software that, like, you can risk assess till the cows come home, but until you get it in the final place, there is something very meaningful about testing the finished product. So basically you made it clear that you're not testing 300,000, but like how much are you actually testing and what is the expectation there?
Okay. Yeah, I understand your question. So this is my personal opinion about
Yeah,
this, because
all of
the
this
guidance
is.
the guidance doesn't say anything about. Yeah, correct. Yeah, the guidance doesn't say anything about this specifically. So I always think about this as like EDDO plus, where you have your, if I have an injector, I have my traditional design verification program that I would establish, where for an emergency use product, you're still doing all those things, but then you're adding on like the plus, which is really the sort of like the sequential challenge testing, where you have a batch of product that you're running sequentially through all these different conditions and testing them. Again, I don't think there's a question to me about, for example, let's take dose accuracy. I've got a set of devices that I'm testing, and I'm assessing what I'm measuring things, dose accuracy, injection time. And then I'm assigning reliability and confidence around those data points. 97.5 or 95% or whatever was in 11608 as an example. That's not the issue in my mind in terms of whether it's acceptable or not, right? So I'm perfectly fine saying, I'm going to take my emergency use product, I'm going to take a batch of them, I'm going to run it through my challenge testing, and I'm going to demonstrate at the end that with 97.5% reliability and 95% confidence, that my dose accuracy is going to meet its specification. Does that make sense? Because you can't, I shouldn't say you can. I don't think it's feasible. The only way you could really, from a mathematical standpoint, demonstrate 5.9's reliability is to test for 300,000.
So what I'm saying is, like, for something like BLEF or cap removal, are you only, it's not even a sample size consideration, because to the point that you made earlier, you're testing 30, 60, whatever, using K values and tolerance intervals to come up with what your confidence and reliability are. It's not even, you're not going to be testing more than 100 samples for functional performance. And so I'm just asking, is there additional scrutiny on what you apply towards those attributes because they are EDDOs in design verification, or it's all the same?
Yeah, I think the only real difference are the conditions that you're doing the testing. Because you really are
Okay.
you really are challenging the device in a much more stringent way from a functional standpoint than you would.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. So you're saying for those in particular, yeah, shake and bake,
Correct.
stability, everything. Yeah.
And the other side of it is
Pressure.
like, this is all pre-market rate, your fault treaty. Ideally, this would be a life cycle thing where you, to your point, where you, like, okay, you've done all this, it's all theoretical, right? Until you actually get the product out. I think the other side of that is maintaining that over time to make sure that your controls actually are adequate.
And that makes sense because, and it's no different than like the idea of estimated risk, and then in 14971, 24971, and then it being followed up with the actual like post-market oversight once you have that data available, because you're just doing estimates in the beginning. All right, Alan, where can people find you?
On LinkedIn,
Thanks for coming on again. Always enlightening talking to you, man.
it's always great talking to you. Anytime.